Thank you for joining us today. And let me introduce our presenter. Professor Dennis Epple is the Thomas Lord University Professor of Economics at the Tepper School of Business. He has started out as an aeronautical engineer at Purdue University and then changed into public policy and public affairs at Princeton's Woodrow Wilson School of Public and International Affairs, and then decided to change course and go into economics, where he got at Princeton University. So we're so glad to have him with us. He joined the Tepper School faculty in 1974 and was named the Thomas Lord Professor of Economics in 1996 and the university's highest honor, University Professor, in 2013. We won't talk about the year he spent at another university, but we're glad that he's been here for so long and been a real part of this great community that we have at Carnegie Mellon University. His research focuses on political economics, the economics of education, and public finance. And among his many honors throughout his career, he was named a fellow of the Econometric Society in 2003. And he has a Wikipedia page, which makes him very special. I think all university professors should have a Wikipedia page. So I was so glad to have him with us today. And I'm going to turn over the reins to Professor Dennis Epple now and let him talk to us today about some of his important research on vouchers. So Professor Epple, we'll turn it over to you.
Thank you very much, John, for that kind introduction. Hello, everyone. Welcome to my Zoom classroom. I've been teaching from this classroom since roughly March of last year. I hope you are enjoying this virtual reunion. I know what a great job John and his team do, so I'm sure it's going very well for you. I'm happy to have the opportunity to talk with you about vouchers today, and I've prepared some slides, and so I am going to share my slides with you now. So as you know, my talk is about what we have learned about educational vouchers. So I thought by background it would be useful to tell you a bit about market shares, if you will. So the number of K-12 students enrolled in the US last year was 56.4 million children. 90% of them attended public school, 10% attended private schools. The market share of vouchers is relatively small. The number of K-12 students using vouchers to attend private school in 2020 was roughly 299,000 students. That's 5.2% of private school enrollments, or 0.5% of all K-12 enrollments. By way of comparison, 3.1 million children attend charter schools, so about 5.5%. As you, I'm sure, know, school teachers' unions have been intensely opposed to voucher programs, but they've been more accepting of charter schools. So the presentation I'm doing today draws on work that I have done with my colleagues, Richard Romano and Miguel Urquiola. Rich is at the University of Florida at Gainesville, and Miguel is at Columbia. We have written two surveys of this literature research on vouchers, one a comprehensive review, and then a second which is focused on implications for practitioners. So as I go along, I will be referring to research that has been done by many different people. In the interest of time, though, I will not take the time to cite individual sources, but they are in this, the references provided here. So Milton Friedman, about 20 years ago, advocated educational voucher, not 20 years ago, 60 years ago, roughly, he advocated educational vouchers. And Milton Friedman's argument was that educational vouchers would increase competition and would encourage schools to improve their performance and that it would also encourage schools to hire the best teachers, and that it would then, as his characterization, that the existing bureaucracy of public school teachers are, in his view, tend to be focused on self-interest and as well as on the children, but that the voucher would have the effect of inducing them to be more attentive to the academic performance by freeing up parents to choose any school that they wanted. They could attend a private school or send their child to public school. So the talk today, I've just given you this synopsis. I will then discuss the issues that theoretical analysis in economics has raised about the Friedman voucher, discuss evidence on the Chilean voucher, and then some alternative voucher designs. So again, Friedman's argument, urban school districts excessively bureaucratic, slow to innovate, managed by educational professionals who tend to be self-serving, sometimes in conflict with students. Market provision would unleash competition, schools would be more efficient, effective teachers would be rewarded, ineffective teachers would be weeded out, competition would promote innovation, and because they reside disproportionately in large urban districts, lower SES students would be the major beneficiaries. So Friedman envisioned a voucher that would offer the same amount to all students. This has come to be known as a universal flat rate voucher. And he would have minimum standards imposed on schools, as he put it, much as government now inspects restaurants to ensure they maintain minimum sanitary standards. He would also permit private schools to impose admission requirements and charge additional attention. Milton Friedman was a brilliant economist, and so this advocacy by him brought much attention to this proposal. Now, theoretical economic analysis of Friedman's voucher proposal was not so positive about the likely prospects, and indeed, the analysis had the implication or the predictions that higher SES parents would top up the voucher to get their children into better schools. High ability students would be rewarded by tuition discounts, by financial aid to induce them to attend the better schools. Schools attended by higher SES parents would have more resources because of the topping up. And there would be what is called stratification, with higher SES children attending higher quality schools, while disadvantaged students would be left behind in weakened public schools or poor quality private schools, which has come to be known in the education research domain as cream skimming. The Chilean voucher, so first of all, before I turn to that, so the four questions that my colleagues and I have investigated is, what effects do vouchers have on the students who use them? Do vouchers induce cream skimming? Do voucher programs pressure public schools to be more efficient? So this was one of Friedman's arguments, that the public schools would have to get better in order to survive, and that the private schools, to attract students, would have to have good performance. And then there's the issue of what's the effect on overall educational performance when we combine the students in voucher schools and the students in public schools. So the first Chilean voucher program was introduced in 1981, and it very closely followed Friedman's vision. All students gained access to a voucher equal to per student expenditure in the public schools. All schools had to implement elements of a national curriculum and participate in standardized exams. There were few other restrictions imposed on private schools. Schools could be religious, could operate for profit. Schools were allowed to implement their own admissions policies and charge tuition higher than the voucher if they wished to do so. So the analysis of the Chilean voucher reveals that municipalities with the greatest voucher growth had the greatest increase in income stratification across schools. So there was an exodus of the middle class students from public schools into voucher schools. The public school performance worsened in part because of the exit of more able students to voucher schools. And most importantly, there was no overall gain in education performance, public and private combined. There was much dissatisfaction with the effects of the program, the income stratification, coupled with lack of gains for low SES students. So there were major reforms in 2008. Further reforms in 2016 increased the voucher amount and froze the tuition add-ons. And the intent now is to phase out topping up so that the voucher is accepted for full cost and no school that accepts vouchers can charge more. So the Chilean experience then with the universal flat rate voucher was not very favorable and very much in line with the predictions of the theoretical economic analysis. The longest standing voucher program in the US began in 1990 in the Milwaukee Public School District, which serves the city of Milwaukee. The program was named the Milwaukee Parental Choice Program, known by a shorthand voucher program. The program was actually created by the Wisconsin state government. Howard Fuller, an African-American who served as superintendent of the Milwaukee Public Schools from 1991 to 1995, strongly endorsed the voucher program, and he continues to do so. And here's a recent quote, which is very much in line with the position he's taken all along. I support parent choice as opposed to school choice. For me, it's more than a semantical difference. I didn't get into this to empower schools. I got into it to empower parents. I want parents to have the power to choose. I don't want schools to have the power to choose them. Now, Fuller was especially concerned that low SES students, minority students with disadvantaged backgrounds have access to the voucher program. So again, as I said, the voucher was set equal to state aid per student, which was roughly half of the expenditure per student in the Milwaukee district, the remainder coming from resources, taxes collected by the city of Milwaukee for the schools. The voucher schools only receive the state allocation of funds. Initially, vouchers were limited to families with income less than 175% of the national poverty line. That was increased over time, increased to 220 in 1995 and 300 in 2011. The number of voucher students was initially limited to 1% of Milwaukee public school enrollment. That cap increased to 1.5% in 1993, 15% in 94, and it's gone up periodically thereafter. Now, here's a key element. Oversubscribed schools are required to select randomly from their pool of applicants. So they can't choose students based on prior test scores or parental motivation to get their kids into the schools. And one other relevant point is that religious schools were not initially eligible for vouchers, but they became eligible by court ruling in 1998. So this shows you the evolution of the Milwaukee program in 3 panels. The number of participating schools grew slowly. Now, remember, there was a cap on the number of students initially. The cap was gradually increased. Religious schools then were made eligible to take voucher students, and so we had quite an increase due to that. And then ongoing increase as new private schools entered. So Friedman's argument was, well, private schools will enter to serve, This is not his universal voucher, but it is a voucher program. Enrollment also went up slowly because of the initial limits. The enrollment in 2016 was roughly 25,000 students, so roughly a fourth of the total number of students in the Milwaukee Public School District. The voucher per student, again, it is the state allocation per student, has gone up over time, in part, of course, due to inflation and due to increased allocations. So this shows you the revenue per student in the voucher schools, the Milwaukee Parental Choice Program, and in the Milwaukee Public Schools. And so that you can see that the revenue per student in the voucher schools is far below what the public schools were getting per student. The accreditation standards require private schools meet one of the following performance standards. At least 70% of voucher-supported students must advance a grade level, or frequency of attendance by voucher students must be at least 90%. At least 80% of program students must demonstrate significant academic progress, and at least 70% of voucher student families must meet parental involvement criteria set by the school. So again, for accreditation, a school must meet at least one of those criteria. So the four questions: what effects do vouchers have on the students who use them? In Milwaukee, the vouchers increased graduation rates, increased the probability of attending college and the probability of persisting in college, magnitude on the order of 4 to 7 percentage points. Do vouchers induce cream skimming? Well, remember, there was income targeting, so eligibility was limited to relatively low-income students. There might still have been cream skimming. One might think more motivated parents might make the effort to apply for a voucher. But the requirement of selecting randomly from the applicant pool, coupled with the income targeting, limited the extent of cream skimming. Do voucher programs pressure public schools to be more efficient? So the research in this domain has investigated, if a voucher school is close to a public school, does the public school up its game? And the answer is there is an impact. The estimates are 40 additional voucher schools, which of course would be spread around the Milwaukee district, would increase overall achievement by approximately 1/10 of a standard deviation in standardized achievement test scores. And then the fourth question, what is the net effect? Oh, and by the way, remember that there are roughly 120 voucher schools now, actually a bit more. So this 1/10 of a standard deviation increase then can be multiplied by the number, so roughly 3 times this impact overall. And then what's the net effect on aggregate educational performance? Well, voucher students and matched public school students had comparable achievement. So the upshot is that the gain noted here applies both to the voucher schools and the Milwaukee public schools. So the public schools also had improved performance as the voucher program grew. So I drew this little picture or histogram to illustrate how big is a standard deviation. So, and this is a made-up distribution, but think of this as the distribution of test scores. One standard deviation shifts this entire distribution to the right by the width of one of these rectangles. So it's not a dramatic effect. On the other hand, in the education realm, moving the dial by this much is not an easy thing to do. Many ideas about improving achievement have been tried, and it's difficult to find successful models. So So the favorable features of the Milwaukee design were to begin with targeting to the poorest students. So it serves the most disadvantaged and also gradually phases in the program. Gradual growth provides time for existing schools to adjust capacity, new schools to enter. Sustained commitment is critical because a private school entering to serve voucher students, for them to do so, they have to be confident that the voucher program will continue. Requiring participating schools to accept the full voucher, no topping up, was also a key element of this design. And then there's been systematic, careful data collection of this program over the years. And that's also been a key, that providing access to third parties to do evaluation. Now, Milwaukee is a success story largely, but the evaluation of 3 US programs targeted to failing schools have found negative achievement effects. That's true in Ohio, Indiana, and Louisiana. They created programs with eligibility limited to poor students and students attending underperforming schools. Again, these vouchers have been a failure. The result is the students who exited these public schools to go to voucher schools had a very substantial decline in academic performance. So this kind of targeting, they're called low-performing schools, but the difficulty is that it may be that the students in these schools are disadvantaged and they may be performing well, relatively speaking. And so just using the grades in the school as a basis is very problematic. There have been randomized controls trials in also in Washington and elsewhere. The New York experiment, the one that started the longest ago, actually found about a 7 percentage point gain in college attendance for African American recipients. A publicly funded voucher experiment in Washington has been studied extensively. Many more applicants than available vouchers, so they were awarded by lottery, creating a natural experiment. The results have been basically little difference between those who got the vouchers and those who didn't, either in achievement or in college enrollment. So this voucher did no harm, but it appears that in terms of achievement, it did not, and graduation, it didn't get improvement. But the amount of the voucher per pupil was only half that in the public schools. So summary then, universal flat rate voucher, very problematic as evidenced by Chile. Vouchers targeting to failing schools, very problematic. The Milwaukee program was implemented, as I described, with several desirable features, and it has yielded favorable outcomes. The Milwaukee program shows the benefits of thoughtful design and a sustained long-term effort. This has been 30 years. So basically, you can't kind of overnight start a voucher program and expect that it's going to succeed. They recently decided to permit topping up, which I think is a serious mistake and risks undoing some of the gains. So thank you. Sorry for running over a bit, John.
I know it's an area that you're very passionate about. And how did you get into research on this, Professor Epple?
Well, I became increasingly into, so to sort of draw back, a nice question, John. Even as a graduate student, I was interested in the sorting of people across municipalities in metropolitan area. The main existing form of school choice in the US is parents vote with their feet. Parents with the resources to do so move to suburban communities with higher quality schools, and the more disadvantaged population remains in the central city. And so having studied that stratification, then I began to ask myself, well, what can be done to improve educational outcomes for people who are then left in the central cities where we've had the disproportionately disadvantaged populations, vouchers initially looked like a promising thing. And as I say, with Milwaukee, it does have promise, but I've gotten interested in lots of other aspects of education programs.
Well, we do have a lot of questions here, so I'll start out with one. Do voucher programs include transportation accommodations for low SES and disadvantaged students who live outside of the district from that school and do not otherwise have access to transportation?
That's a really good question, and the answer has generally been no. In some places, the buses that serve the public schools may also serve the private schools. So in particular, that's true here in Pittsburgh. The bus system that takes kids to public schools will take them to private schools as well. So this is very much kind of district specific kind of policy. But I would say in general, the answer is no. Parents have to get the kids to the schools.
Okay. Another question from Dirk is that how is it that voucher schools can cost half the costs of public schools?
Oh, that's a very good question. And indeed, all of these voucher programs in the US have that feature. And I think that, of course, the main cost of schools is the teachers. And so much of the difference is that voucher schools and private schools more generally are paying their teachers less than public school teachers. So something I might add in that regard is what we don't know is if all schools started paying half of what they currently paid, what would happen to the teacher workforce, for want of a better term, because the incentives to go into education would then drop. And so there might be long-run adverse effects if every school cut, but in any event, the short answer is these schools are paying teachers less. Teachers were happy to take these positions and teach in these schools.
Are there any comparisons of voucher outcomes or to charter schools outcomes that you could share or have studied?
So the evidence on vouchers versus charters is pretty limited, in part because in order to do that comparison, you have to have a pretty substantial presence of both types of schools in a district. And we have not had that in the US. So there's some fledgling work on that. What I can tell you, though, that's relevant is that my colleagues whom I mentioned and I also did an extensive assessment of the charter school literature. And the answer with charter schools is the typical charter school is no better and no worse than the typical public school in the neighborhood of the kids who are attending the charter schools. So charter schools have not lived up to the hope for promise that they would result in increasing quality or increasing educational outcomes.
A couple more questions I think we can take here. Any scientific evidence that parental behavior is the most important determinant in the academic success of the children?
There is a tremendous amount of evidence that parental background matters in the success of students. There's absolutely no question about that.
Okay. And how is the tax burden allocated to? We have a question about that from students outside. Many students from outside the district may attend the voucher school. Are there local taxes forwarded to the voucher school? Or in your case that you talked about earlier, is it just the state funds that are moved?
In Milwaukee, it's just the state funds. The state funds follow the child. So if a kid attends a voucher school, the state funds would follow. But again, generally speaking, local school districts have been pretty hostile to vouchers, and so there isn't this willingness to provide public, to equalize. Whereas with charter schools, often charter schools may get, say, 80% of the average in the district, so they're better funded. They're not fully funded But then charter school or public schools are also serving children with special needs. And so there's a reason not to make it 100%. But anyway, by and large, the answer is that it's been the state in Milwaukee. We have so few otherwise, John, to point to in the U.S. other than these experiments. So we don't have a lot to go on with respect to how would funding evolve. To go back to these failing schools, they were funded, that is, in those states, the funding was coming from the state. As I say, unfortunately, they were just a terrible flop.
Well, as we bring this short version of our Tepper Talks to a close today, where can alumni who are interested in more in-depth research and get a synopsis of your research, where can they get that? I'm happy to. My webpage will have links. But as I said, I've done my colleagues, I've sort of vowed I will never do another review because they're so painstaking and time consuming. But I would be very happy to provide the reviews of the charter and the voucher schools that we've done to anyone who would like to drop me an email. I'd be very happy to do that. Well, great. Well, thank you so much for taking time out of your busy day. And thank you for teaching generations of Carnegie Mellon students economics and so many other things in your courses over the years. We're really honored to have you as a university professor, the highest honor that a professor can receive at a university. So congratulations on that, and many more years of training the next generation of business leaders. Oh, thank you, John. And by the way, to everyone out there, it's been a dream for me to teach at a school the quality of the Tepper School. I couldn't be luckier. Well, great. Well, thank you. And for our alumni, our next presentation will be arriving at 3:00. And so join us today for our talk with Professor Anita Woolley. And you'll hear about how can AI improve the performance of teams. Maybe someday we'll be doing, can AI improve our schools? And we'll have some presentation on that as well. But thank you for joining us. And we look forward to sharing with you in just 10 minutes or so. Thank you.